I use a line that I've used, and it's, you're not ready to live until you're ready to die. And that maybe sound morbid to some people, but unless you've come to a conclusion in your heart and mind about what happens when somebody dies, you're always struggling, and you're not looking forward to dying, because, I mean, nobody's looking forward to dying, but you're not at ease about the certainty of somebody dying, because you haven't nailed that down yet. You haven't said, this is what I believe, and this is why I believe it. Now I'm ready to live, because I know I'm going to die.
This is Andrew Petty is Dying, where we tap into the power of our mortality to become the people we were made to be and live the lives we were made to live. I'm your host, Andrew Petty, and I'm dying. I hate to say it, but so are you. My guest today is someone none of us would ever hope to meet when he's on the job. That's because Rob Rigg is a coroner. His work begins when someone else's life ends, suddenly and tragically. And this conversation is a report from the front lines, so to speak. I invited Rob to be on the show because after 17 years as coroner, he has stood in the sacred, grief-filled gap between the living and the dead hundreds of times. He's been privy to moments of courage and grace in the face of loss, and also there when those left behind come unhinged. He's heard what the grieving regret most. He knows better than most of us the havoc that death leaves in its wake. It's that perspective that we'll tap into to gain fresh inspiration and motivation to do today what we keep putting off until, quote, tomorrow, to put living the lives we were made to live on the front burner today. Lest you're tempted to tune out because this conversation sounds like too much of a downer, I've got good news. You'll come away encouraged by Rob's life-affirming perspective, paradoxically cultivated from hundreds of encounters with death. Because, paradoxically, our relationship with death is really about our relationship with life. And by intentionally confronting our mortality now, before we have no choice, we train ourselves to live with greater guts, gusto, and abandon. So don't tune out, tune in, weigh in, and let this conversation about death bring you even more to life. Along the way, Rob shares how his faith comes into play, and I happen to share Rob's overall orientation, spiritually speaking. I know that there are as many different spiritual flavors and philosophies among our listeners as there are listeners. Neither Rob nor I presume to have all of the answers, or is out to persuade you to our way of thinking. Rather, I hope the spiritual parts of this conversation will prompt your own spiritual reflection and introspection, because for we humans, there are perhaps no topics more spiritual than life, death, and what happens next. Rob and I were just acquaintances before this conversation. I can tell you after this conversation, though, that if I were ever to die suddenly and tragically, I would want Rob to be the guy to comfort my family and tend to my newly vacated mortal coil. He has a calm and direct way about him, a gaze that holds yours firmly and gently, and a heart for people above all. He also had his own intense encounter with mortality just 3 years ago. So he speaks with a credibility gained from personal experience, not just experience gained on the job. All right, let's get to it. Here today with Rob Rigg, who is a friend of mine, an acquaintance of mine anyway, in town through my wife here in Steamboat Springs. And it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast today, Rob. Thanks for doing this. We pulled it together quickly. My schedule for guests was kind of up in the air and some things hadn't worked out, and I was kind of going through my mental Rolodex, and your name was on my list already, but then it came back to the surface, and I thought, this is a great time to reach out to you and to see if you were available. And so we had our first preliminary conversation last Friday, and today's Monday, and here we are doing it. We're throwing this thing together quickly, which is fun, and I appreciate you doing it. And you're getting ready to go away for a month-long time away with your siblings, which you've said you do once or twice or even 3 times a year for a month. And so thanks for making time for this. Right before we were going to get on the air, Rob was sharing with me his adventures of yesterday evening. Life as a coroner here in this town, and I'm sure in any town, there's never a dull moment. And he had a wild night in the woods looking for and recovering a body. Is it okay for me to say all this on the... Mm-hmm. Maybe I'm getting into sensitive topics. So thank you for being here after a wild night in the woods doing coroner work. Some of my fascination with talking to Rob and why I thought it might be useful for our listeners is this coroner's perspective. And before we dive into exactly what the coroner does and those kinds of things in your personal experience, how did you become coroner? I know a little bit of your story, and you would not necessarily have connected all of those dots to come up with coroner at this stage in life for you at 73.
It's kind of interesting how this all happened. I'm not one of those people that has planned out their life and said, this is what I want to do when I'm such and such an age, and this is my goal and stuff. A lot of times things happen. And I was a pastor here in Steamboat for 18 years. And how this happened, becoming coroner, is that one of the people that attended our church owned the funeral home in town and asked me one day if I felt comfortable if he was out of town to go pick up a body when somebody dies and bring them to the funeral home. And I didn't really think that through very well, but I thought I could do that. And so I agreed to do that.
He was trying to arrange for a substitute.
Right. He needed a backup. And so I made that decision to say, hey, if you need me, just call me if you're going out of town. And because at the time he was what they call a deputy coroner, which and the whole coroner thing is a kind of a technical thing, but it's unattended deaths, it's accidents, it's suicides, homicides, those type of things. It's not your normal hospice death or something like that. So I agreed to do that, and then after doing that for a while, he says, you ought to become a deputy coroner like myself. And I said, okay, I think I'm able to do this, and it'd be interesting for me to do more of the investigation type, because I'm kind of a curious guy. Some people would say nosy, but I like to figure things out, and that became interesting to me. And so I did that for almost, I think, 7 or 8 years that I was a deputy coroner and went to these unattended deaths or these accidental deaths or whatever. And during that time, the coroner, who I knew very well, decided to retire, and the commissioners here asked me if I would fill in that role for the rest of his term.
It's an elected position, correct?
It's an elected position, but you can ask somebody to finish out your term, and that's what this coroner did. He said, would you be willing to finish out, I think it was like 1.5 years or something on his term. And I had been doing it for, a few years, so I felt, I'll help them out and do this. Well, at the end of his term, it became an election then, and the commissioners came to me and said, hey, nobody's running for coroner, and would you run for it? So I just said, okay, I'll do that. And I remember talking to the board at the church when I decided to do this, and they felt that it was a kind of a good fit for pastor coroner, because there are some situations where it becomes a counseling session. It becomes more of a, helping the family getting through a difficult time in their life. So anyway, long story short, I did that, and that was 17 years ago now. And every 4 years, most of those times I ran out of post, but the last 2 or 3 times there have been opposition, I'm running as a Republican. I really more of an independent, but I ran on the Republican ticket, and now recently there's been some Democrats and some independents that have run, but I think this will be my last term. I have 2 years left on this term, so I'll be 75 then, and I'll be looking for my next adventure after that, I think.
Well, thank you for all those years of service. We're going to dig more into what those years of service have actually been like for you and what you've learned. But my goodness, what an invaluable service to the community to have someone, especially with that kind of tenure, and in a small town like this, somebody who knows somebody. It's not many degrees of separation between any of us in a small town like this. I'm really curious what it was like when your funeral home director friend said, hey, would you sub for me? And by the way, subbing for me is picking up dead bodies. That's quite a deal. And you said you did do that for a little while before that person recommended that you become a deputy coroner. What was it like in that period where you were subbing for your funeral home director friend in his stead, showing up in these situations in a professional capacity, not having ever done that before, and retrieving these bodies.
Right. Now that you mention that, I don't remember the first time that I was called to do that, but I'm sure there was kind of, this is different now. I've never done this before. I guess I did go with him maybe a couple times when he was still here, but it's a little uneasy at the first to walk into a situation where somebody's died and know what to do and know how to talk and know what to say, know what not to say. Because my experience now in doing this for many years is that death never comes at the right time, and it's always unexpected. Even if somebody's been sick for a long time, they want that person to continue to live, and it's an ending of their life and ending of their relationship together. So it's powerful.
And you were there in even in those early stages, you were there in the formal coroner duties, right? So there was an expectation that you would perform certain steps
Right.
in those moments. And I guess it worked okay for you. You found like it was an okay fit.
Right. After I did this for a while, I realized that I can do this. And it's not like I stay up all night thinking about what I just saw or the sadness of people losing loved ones. It's not like I became callous to it, but I was able to do it and not have it affect me where I couldn't sleep or whatever. And I know people would probably say, well, then you got kind of hard about death. I'm really not hard about death, but I look at death differently, I guess, than when I come to a situation because of my background, because of my being a pastor, is I look at that body as a container. A Bible calls it a tent. It's a temporary dwelling, and that person is, to my understanding biblically, is not there anymore. So I'm helping take care of that container and being sensitive to the family that not everybody thinks the same way that I think, because they think that maybe is over and they'll never see that person again or whatever. So I look at things different, and it helps me to. It doesn't make it easier when I see people that are really struggling. And I mean, I've been in situations where the people that are left behind are just totally distraught and totally out of control because of the loss of a loved one. So I understand that, but I also understand that I have a different perspective on life and death.
Yeah, the person that used to inhabit that body, and your worldview, isn't inhabiting that body any longer, but is nevertheless alive in another state.
Right. That's what I believe. And I don't know that everybody believes that. I know in my experience, people don't like to talk about death. They don't like to even entertain the idea that this is a temporary deal that we're involved in. And one day we're not going to be here. And I always say that every person asks 3 questions, either internally or maybe with their friends, talks about where did we come from? How do I get the most out of this life while we're here? And what happens when I'm gone? I think everybody, whether they verbally talk about those or not, are struggling with that, and in real ways that eventually affect their life now.
How did you come to that short list of 3 questions?
I don't know. I've done a lot of funerals, and so when I look out on the audience there, the people that have come to be a part of that, I normally say that. I say, every one of you have asked, 3 questions, and they kind of look puzzled when I say that. And basically in their heart, they're saying, I never ask any questions. Where did I come from? How do I get the most out of life? And what happens? Because we're looking at this person that has passed away and wondering if they'll ever see them again. And how do I know that? What is my basis for making that claim that life is over, or there's a heaven, or there's not a heaven, or we'll all go to heaven, or whatever? I think there's a real challenge for us to back that up with, and I back it up with the Bible, other people, I'm not sure what they back it up with. Most of it's what my parents taught me, or how I grew up, and relationships with people have told me these things, and so I believe them.
It's one of those moments in an interview where there's so many different forks in the road and so many different paths we could chase, and I always get nervous I'm going to lose one of them later and not come back to it. I think I want to first just real quickly get from you, for myself and for our listeners, what specifically does a coroner do? Where do they fit into the process and the processing of a death? And I heard you earlier alluding to the fact that it's unexpected death. This isn't just someone who's in the hospital and passed away, but something sudden has happened, and sometimes it's tragic. So just quickly outline the coroner's role in that chain of events.
Okay, there's three basic things that I'm required by the state to do, and that's the cause of death, the manner of death, and to notify the next of kin of the deceased. Okay, so the cause of death, there's manner. Manner is there's 5 different manners of death. So on a death certificate, you're going to see accident, natural, homicide, suicide, or they don't know, undetermined. So those 5 things. So my job is to make sure that the death certificate has the correct one of those 5. And then, like, if it's an accident, then we have to kind of develop, well, what happened in this accident? If it's a natural, what was the natural cause of their death? Was it a heart issue? Was it a cancer issue? Whatever. And that's either done through talking to the doctor of this person that died, or doing an autopsy and determining what the cause of death was through that. And that's one of my jobs too, is to determine, do we need to do an autopsy?
And that's done by the medical examiner?
And that's done by a pathologist that we contract from the county. So we bring the body to the facility for the autopsy. And then, like I say, the other thing is to contact the next of kin. And sometimes that's very simple. Sometimes it's somebody who's visiting here and they're by themselves and we really don't know who that is. And it can take up to 3 or 4 days to find somebody that's related to this person.
And in a town like ours, our town is what, 12 or 13,000 annual year-round residents. How often are you responding to your coroner duties?
Okay, in an average, we do like a budget for the coroner's office. An average year for us is like 40 cases. But right now, at the end of September now, 2020, we have 38 cases already, and we have 3 more months left. So we're going to go over the average for sure this year. And then out of those cases, about half of those get autopsied, because the other half we, either through doctors or talking to people that know this person, we know why they died.
Over budget, that's interesting. I guess in hindsight, we'll know better how much of that had to do with the pandemic situation and the mental health challenges that go along with that and all those kinds of things.
For what it's worth, my involvement with the coronavirus thing has been very minimal, because we people that have gotten this virus, we know that that's what caused their death. So it's part of the determination of what was the cause of death.
I'm pausing because I'm trying to pick the path I want to go down at this point. I want to add those 3 questions that you brought up, which I think are really useful questions. And I agree with you, by the way, that I think on some level, all of us are pondering those questions in our hearts and minds. It's just a matter of at what level of consciousness. But I think those questions and maybe a few others are motivating us in some way most moments of most days. It's just a matter of how much we're aware of the answers to those questions. How has your experience as coroner influenced the way you answer those questions, or your relationship to those 3 questions?
Well, I think most people don't talk about death very much. They're forced to do it.
And when we sat down on my porch on Friday, you said, I like to talk about death. Mm-hmm. And now on the one hand, you might think, well, he's the coroner, so maybe but that's not what you were saying. You weren't saying, because I'm a coroner, I like to talk about it. You were saying it for different reasons.
Yeah, I use a line that I've used and it's you're not ready to live until you're ready to die. And that maybe sound morbid to some people, but unless you've come to a conclusion in your heart and mind about what happens when somebody dies, you're always struggling, and you're not looking forward to dying, because I mean nobody's looking forward to dying, but you're not at ease about the certainty of somebody dying, because you haven't nailed that down yet. You haven't said, this is what I believe, and this is why I believe it. Now I'm ready to live, because I know I'm going to die. That's not and we can get into the theological. Yeah. Well, not everybody's going to die because there's a rapture coming and all that, but we're going to be changed. There's a different thing happening. There's a different thing coming. It's an eternal thing. It's not a temporary thing. This is a temporary thing, and I know people. That's hard for a lot of people to believe and to grasp and to own, is that, I've got a certain period of time in this life, and I know that that's going to end, and I've come to an understanding of what I believe about that. Now I'm ready to live. I'm not worried about dying. I'm not worried about what if I die. I'm going to die, and therefore I've got that taken care of, and I think the Bible gives us a pretty good way to take care of that. I know there's probably other ways that people take care of that, but I don't know where they get their info as to why they believe the way they believe.
What changed for you when you then began to live? Because that's what you said the transition is. Once you kind of wrestle the death question to the ground, then you're ready to live. So what did it look like when you had resolved that for yourself sufficiently and began to live? What changed for you?
It's kind of a freeing. It's kind of okay. I believe that. I believe this is temporary, and then you can kind of enjoy life and enjoy what's ahead of you. I came to a point in my early 20s. I don't know what year that would be, but 1974. That would be when I'm like 27.
I was born that year. Just saying.
I came to this understanding biblically that really changed my whole theological position as a young person, because I grew up in a church that believed that Jesus died so I could go to heaven, and I realized at that particular point I grew up with that whole idea that get saved, because then you're going to heaven, and then just live your life the way you want to live it. And then I realized I came across a verse in 2 Corinthians one day in a little study we had with a couple guys, and 2 Corinthians 5:15 says this, "And he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died and rose again on their behalf." And just like this huge light bulb went off in my head. Jesus died not so that I could go to heaven, but so that I could live a different kind of a life. And that to me changed my whole perspective on my life. I'm now to live a life that pleases Christ. And whatever that looks like, whether I'm a coroner or a pastor or a youth pastor or a carpenter or whatever, I want to live my life to please God. That's why he saved me. He didn't save me to go to heaven. And I think a lot of us as Christians kind of check that box. I'm saved. Now I can do whatever I want, and I don't have to worry about what's going to happen when I die. It's a totally different thing when you think, no, that's a bonus, but it's not the reason. The reason is so that I could live a different type of a life. And I think that totally changed my understanding of becoming a Christian and accepting Christ as my Savior.
And to our listeners, Rob and I share a worldview around faith and things like that. And Rob has just beautifully described some of what, most Christians would agree to, generally speaking, about where we came from and where we're going and what the purpose of this life is. And each of you listening out there has some belief, however unformed, about where we came from and what this life is for and what happens next. And What I hope is not necessarily that you buy into what Rob and I are what our convictions are, but rather that you're asking yourself those same questions, the ones that the three that Rob offered at the very beginning, because our relationship to those questions, our answers to those questions, has everything to do with the way that we're living our lives. And for many of you listening, if there's an unsettledness in your heart and mind, it could be attributed just to the fact that these questions exist in the hearts and minds of men, but maybe in women, but maybe you haven't yet really given them much attention. And so I hope all of you listening will hear these three questions that Rob is asking us, and to the degree that you haven't really chewed on them, you'll chew on them and wrestle some of those to the ground, because they have everything to do with the life that you're living right now and how freely you can live it, and with how much guts, gusto, and abandon, as I say sometimes on this show. And of course, this show exists to help as many of us live with guts, gusto, and abandon as we can, because there's never been another Rob Rigg, and there never will be again, nor has there ever been another Andrew Petty, and there won't ever again be another Andrew Petty. And same for each of you listening. So your life has unique purpose and value in the world. And my hope is that day by day, you are understanding your purpose in the world more deeply and more clearly, and living it out with greater guts, gusto, and abandon. Rob, what's it like to stand between the living and the dead in those first painful moments?
Many times when I walk away from a situation, I'll say to the police or the fire or whoever there, because of the situation, there's another wasted life because of obvious things that we see in this, whether it's a drunk driving thing or a drug overdose or whatever. That really goes with me when I leave, because I think there are a lot of lives that are wasted because of, and I'm not trying to say anything negative about a particular person, but because of the addiction issue, and because of people's inability to say they need help or whatever, there's a life that's wasted. And most of the people that I deal with in my being a coroner are much younger than I am. And so I look at my life, and I look at a 30-year-old life, that somebody that takes their life, and I said, that's a waste. That's a sad waste of a life. And there's probably a story around that, probably a book that could be written about this person's life. And so that to me is the saddest part of being a coroner, is to see this didn't have to happen. This is a sad time. Death is sad, but then there's some that are, I guess you could say, that are sadder than others.
What are you learning about most people's relationship to death and to life by being in these moments with them? I mean, because these are the moments when they're really pushed. I mean, what they really think, what they really feel, who they really are is coming out in probably the least filtered way ever in the face of this trauma and this grief. So how has your perspective on humans and humanity and our relationship with life and death shifted because of your experience?
I think a lot of people blame themselves for something that happens to their loved one. They should have done something to keep this from happening, whether it's an unhealthy lifestyle, that they should have pushed them a little bit and challenged them a little bit more. I see that a lot. I wish I could have helped them more. I wish I could have done something to. But most of all, it's the fact that they didn't believe this was going to happen. They didn't believe that this was around the corner. They thought they had more time to deal with whatever, if it was a preventable situation. A lot of times they're not. I mean, they're just a heart attack or a death that is, they know is coming. But it's still, when it happens, there's still that, what do we do now? I don't know if I'll be able to continue on without this person or whatever. It's everybody deals with it a little bit differently. From my perspective, even though I've seen both sides of the coin. People have a little bit more of a basis of faith, deal with death a little bit better. People who have a lot of questions and death is a surprise and it's an end that they didn't want to see coming, and deal with it differently. And it's very apparent a lot of times. And to me, that is very sad too.
Your mention that a lot of people express regrets that they wish they had done this or done that. They thought they had more time. Really touches on a major theme of this podcast, which is we have no idea how much time we have, but we do have this moment, we do have this day, and so just an exhortation to all of our listeners: if there are strained relationships in your life, why not let today be the day that you take the step to begin doing something differently in that relationship? If you have a loved one or a friend, a colleague who you know is struggling in some desperate way, and you keep meaning to have that conversation or keep meaning to write that note, why not let that be today? Maybe you are struggling in a really acute way, and maybe someone knows it, maybe someone doesn't. Rob, you show up, unfortunately, on the scenes of suicides and homicides and situations where things went badly sideways very quickly. And if you're someone who's hurting and struggling, then I hope that you won't fail today to let someone else know and to reach out so that you can begin to make different steps forward in life. So it's certainly a clarion call to us to not let today pass. If there's something that we can do to help another person or even to help ourselves, so that we don't end up one of these grim statistics or unwittingly let a friend or a family member end up as one of these grim statistics. Now, of course, we can't know everything and we can't help everybody, but what can you do where you are with who you know, I think is a great question for us to be asking ourselves today, because no day is assured. There aren't any other days assured to us than the one we have today. How do you live differently because of your experience as a coroner?
I think about that a lot. How does it affect me? I guess the number one thing for me is I want to take advantage of every opportunity I have to live, because I know about 3 years ago I had open heart surgery. I had an aneurysm, and my doctor said if I hadn't discovered this, that I wouldn't have made it through that year. So I understand that things can happen. And I remember going to the doctor, and he said, you have a little heart murmur, you ought to have it checked. And the next year I went for my physical, and he says, you haven't gone for that check on that, have you? I would encourage him. My wife was with me at that time. She says, you're going to go. So I went and had this ultrasound, and they found this stretching of my aorta like twice the size that it should be in a certain area. And my doctor said, you got to get that taken care of like right away, because that could burst and that's over. And I've done, I've seen autopsies with that particular situation. And when the aorta bursts, there's not much time to save that person. So I understand, both in my personal experience as a coroner and my personal experience, my own physical body, that life can end quickly and unexpectedly. And so I like to make sure that I take it. I think life's an adventure, and one of the quotes that I've used a lot in my preaching and stuff is, I think it was from Anthony Campolo. He said, life is for many the meaningless passage of time between all too few moments of really being alive. And that has stuck with me for years, because I think for us, life does become a lot of times the meaningless passage of time, and between those few moments of really being alive. And then I don't know how you define what being alive is, but
how do you define being alive?
I define being alive as taking advantage of opportunities I have to what's placed before me, opportunities to in my relationship with God, to have my eyes open to people that I can help or encourage or whatever. So that's when I'm alive. That's when I understand That's one of the reasons that God gave me right now. I'm going to take advantage of that. Otherwise, it's, kind of a monotonous daily routine to make a paycheck or whatever. And then all of a sudden there's these opportunities to be alive. So for me, it's having my eyes open and being aware of, obviously for me as a coroner, things are put in front of me and I have to deal with them. But many of those times I've given the opportunity to help and to encourage. I think I told you the other day when we were talking about a woman here in Steamboat who raised a boy for 32 years with cerebral palsy and loved that guy, and for the last 20 years of his life never spoke a word, and how that would be for me. I look at myself, how would I deal with that? And when I saw her that day, I said to her, "You're an amazing woman," and just how that encouraged her. I found out later. I just, that was one of those, that point of taking advantage of encouraging that woman. Didn't mean anything to me, but it just was an opportunity to encourage that woman whose life has completely changed in just a moment.
You spoke earlier about the freedom that you gain from the perspective on where you came from and where you're going after this life, and how it allows you to just live, and how your experience as a coroner has helped you to be mindful each day of the opportunities that you have. So maybe what I'm asking for is, like, with your experience as coroner and your wiring as a person, kind of what is your approach to life, your philosophy of life? How do you interact with this idea of Rob Riggs' purpose in the world?
I think the most joy, and I'm not trying to, make myself look good or anything. I'm just saying the most joy that I've experienced as a man, as a husband, as a father, grandfather, great-grandfather, is giving, is serving, is doing things for my family and my friends, and that there's more joy in that to me than anything I could accomplish on my own. So I'm not saying that to make myself look like some kind of a special person. I just believe that that's how God's wired us, is that there's more joy in giving than receiving. And I think once you, and I've got a long way to go on that. I have my selfish tendencies but I feel like I'm more fulfilled in those roles of helping and doing and being involved in people's lives and stuff. I'm not there yet, but in my experience over my 73 years, there's a lot of joy in giving and helping and being involved in other people's life, other than just, building up my portfolio or whatever.
Mm-hmm. What is that joy? What is that joy feedback that you get? What's happening there for you?
It's a hard thing to define, I think. It's just, I think that's why God has placed us here, and when we do that, there's joy in that. It's like doing what you're expected to do. It's like I think a kid, when he's told to do something and his parents ask him to do something, I think they feel good about that. And when they don't do something, they kind of hide. And so it's the same kind of thing. It's how I think we're wired that way. And when we do that, it feels good. It feels natural. I think that's truth. And I think truth is a very hard thing. Truth always wins. And if you think life's all about you, and I think life is all about me, I'm not going to feel that or experience that joy that I think God wired us to experience.
Mm-hmm. And you gave a great example on Friday. We were talking on my porch about how truth is like the proverbial beach ball that you try to hold under the water at a pool, and you can, but you have to continually push it down to keep it down. But as soon as it squirts to the side, or you release your hands from it, it pops up above the water again.
And a lot of times hits you in the face. And
Yeah.
so that's truth to me. And we can spend our whole life holding truth, that one day I'm going to die. Okay. I don't want to deal with that truth, but eventually that will, or I don't have a problem in this area, or I don't have an addiction, or I don't have a person that I can't relate to. I don't want to relate to. I do. Let's let that ball up, and there's some freedom in that, because you spend your whole life holding this ball under whatever the ball is. It can get old and it get difficult.
And it's not really living, I guess, is it either? Where you're spending significant time and energy trying to suppress something that will remain true whether you acknowledge it or not. In this case, especially for the purpose of this podcast, the fact that this earthly life in the form that we know it for all of us will in fact end sometime. And hopefully for all of us, for you and me here today and for everybody listening, we have a long runway ahead of us. But many of us don't. And for sure, someone within the sound of my voice, our voices on this podcast, has a much shorter runway than they'd anticipated.
I have an illustration of this whole idea of death. A very good friend of mine was dying of cancer, and he lived in Wheaton, Illinois, and he had a place out here in Steamboat. We were very close, and he was very open and honest about his illness. And I'd go visit him back in Wheaton at the hospital there. And one day I was at the hospital visiting him. The nurse was in the room at the time, and this guy, Dave, said to the nurse, "This is Rob, and he's going to be doing my funeral." And she was just totally taken by that. And she left the room crying. And Dave's, that's the way he dealt with the reality. It's just, I'm going to be dying soon, and Rob's going to be doing my funeral. And that was so, and here's a nurse. I mean, she's dealt with death on a regular basis. But just the way that Dave approached it, it wasn't like a sad thing for him. It was just a matter of fact that this is what's going to happen. So he said to me, "Would you go out in the hallway and just apologize to her because I didn't mean to upset her, but I wanted her to know who you were and stuff." So that was very interesting to me, and an interesting illustration to me of looking at death, the reality of death, in a very open way with people who don't look at it that way.
Well, it's such a picture in contrasts, isn't it? Dave had come to the place in his life and his understanding of his condition and his relationship with life and death that he could say that in a matter-of-fact way. And
I hope I can do that one day if I'm on that bed, to be as open about where I'm, because I think to me, it's encouraging to people that you can face death with certainty and with honesty. And I want to do that, because I think and then I'm hoping that people will say, "Well, how in the world can you say that? How can you?" And then that opens up a line of communication, which I think people need to have.
So if you got a terminal diagnosis now, do you think you'd be able to say something like Dave said?
I hope I will.
The same amount of.
I believe I will. I mean, I'm not looking forward to that.
Yeah.
It was interesting. My sister-in-law was diagnosed with cancer back in April when we came back from Florida. We had been together in Florida. Never knew that and she's been battling that now for 6 months, chemo and surgery and all that. And she's going to have her last treatment coming up this Thursday. It happens. I mean, when we were in Florida 6 months ago, this wasn't even a thought. And now for the last 6 months, she's been dealing with that. So it's real, it's unexpected many times, and it's how you deal with that when the C word is brought up by your doctor. You've got cancer. Well, how does that affect your life?
That reminds me of what you said earlier. You said one of the things you've come to know as the coroner is that death never comes at a good time. It never comes when you're expecting it. And I remember sitting on the porch, hearing you say that and going, as much work as I think I do in my own life through this podcast and just personally to sort of live mindfully with mortality, that still struck me, because to think that somehow I can be prepared when that moment comes, or I even said on the last episode of the podcast, the solo episode, I said, let's not be counted among those who act surprised when death shows up as if it was going to skip us, but let's be counted among those who can say, hi, I've been expecting you. But you're basically saying very few of us ever get to actually greet death in that manner, because it kind of never comes when you're expecting it.
I ran into a woman yesterday whose husband died here at 52, sitting watching his kids play lacrosse. He was in the press booth or whatever, and just died of an aneurysm, right? In 52. Never had any indication of. So, I mean, and she's doing great. I mean, she's an amazing woman. But that was obviously totally unexpected. 52, watching his kids play lacrosse, and falls off the stool while sitting up in the press box. So that's my experience a lot of times. It's just totally unexpected.
My second guest on this podcast, Allison Cheney, I think she was the second guest. Anyway, early on in the podcast, they lost one of their twins 5 days after the twin was born. And she said, as she's continued to grieve and to move through that loss and to live differently as a result, that one of the things she's come to is it's not worth trying to figure out what your thing is going to be. In other words, your crisis or when it's going to come or in what form, because you just don't know. And I think that stands to reason, right? But I think it's still easy to spend a lot of time and energy trying to perfectly engineer our lives or to create circumstances so that we can see the storm on the horizon when it's brewing. And these aren't the kind of storms that we typically see brewing, you're saying, and Allison is saying. And so for me, the takeaway from that is like, part of living with mortality in mind is doing today, just doing today, because you don't know. And it's surprisingly hard to just do today, I think, because we live in a world full of planners, and the best laid plans can get gobbled up pretty quick by a life crisis. I want to touch back on your experience having to have open heart surgery. And I'm curious, you've been coroner for, at this, I guess by the time of your surgery, 15 or 16 years, right? And seeing a lot of death, been in a lot of critical situations. But then there you are under the knife in your own critical situation. What difference was there for you in being the one in the critical situation as opposed to being the one serving those in a critical situation? How did that affect you?
Well, I mean, the reality that I'm not invincible, I'm fallible, and I have areas of my life that are susceptible to everything that I see every day. And I think that the reality of, I could have died, and I look at pictures of myself in the hospital, I look like death, what they do. And I've been to a number of autopsies. I know what's involved. And when they open you up and cut your sternum and open your chest up and deflate your lungs and take your heart out and do whatever they do to repair it, there's a lot of things that could happen. So I knew that, obviously I might not make it through that. But I never really thought about that. It's a lot. I knew that could happen, but I never believed that I wasn't going to walk out of that hospital or ride a wheelchair out of that hospital after a week spending there. So I never really was worried about dying. I think people around me were. I think my kids looked at that and they were scared that their dad was, down on the bed and all these tubes and stuff sticking out of them and stuff like that. But I never really was in fear. And I think it's because of, that God's given me peace about, if it's that time, It's funny, we as Christians talk about heaven as like the amazing place that everybody wants to go. But if you said to somebody, you want to go today? Not sure. I want to go to Costco yet, or whatever. We are so strange. We make heaven out to be this. You can't even explain what it's going to be like, but really don't want to go there right now. And I get it. I get what that's about, but I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to seeing what that's about. I want to take advantage of every opportunity I have to live, but I'm looking forward to seeing what's on the other side.
I want to tie back again to your experience as coroner and all the different reactions and responses you've seen from people having lost someone that was close to them. How can we learn from the regrets that were expressed in those moments? What specifically would you say, for the most part, people can prioritize more or differently than we currently are, based upon your experiences of seeing people having lost loved ones and friends suddenly? What are the common themes to the misplacement of priorities or time or energy that pop up?
Yeah. I think for all of them, they would say something like this: I wish we had spent more time together, or I wish that we had done this. I wish I'd have said this. So I think there's regrets in things not done, things that could have been done. We can only do so much to prevent, suicides and stuff like that. And I remember just talking to a girl recently whose husband took his life. She blamed herself for something that was done. And you can't do that. You can't. That was a decision that this person made, and that's the way you have to look at it. And I know it's going to take a long time for that to bear itself out. But I think for the most part, I take advantage of the time you have together. And it's never going to be enough when somebody dies unexpectedly, and you're going to still say, I wish we'd have done this, or wish I'd have said that, or wish whatever. And you can't do everything, but take advantage of the things that you can do. Because life is really short. We moved here, my daughter was 9, okay? She's 48 now. My son was 43, or he was 5, and now he's 43. And that's amazing to me. They've got their own families and businesses, and I say, I wish I'd have done more with them. As a pastor for 18 years, you sacrifice time with your family and all that kind of stuff. And I wish that we'd have done other things, but that's done. Now, what am I going to do today with my kids and my grandkids and my great-grandson? So I think it's just a matter of, we can say, I wish, but what can you do right now to make up for maybe some things that you didn't do? What can you do today? I think that's kind of your, what can I do today that I can say, I'm glad I did that. I'm glad I went here or did that, or I'm glad I wrote that note, or that's what I look at when I hear people say, I wish. What can we do now with the people that we're interacting with, our family and friends?
And like you said, it can just be a note. It can be a phone call. It can be a walk with a friend, a family member. It can be resolving those I wish statements now. It doesn't have to be a Herculean effort, right? It doesn't mean I have to upend my whole life and sell everything I have and begin working at the homeless shelter. Although you could do that, it doesn't necessarily have to mean that. It can be just the little things. Obviously, people are the theme here, I think, right? Because when someone leaves, you're missing that person and you're wishing different things for that relationship.
And I think one of the things that I think people think of when a loved one dies or a friend dies is unanswered questions or unresolved conflicts or problems. They can't do that. They can't. Last year when I did that was really a stupid thing on my part. And they can't do that. So I would think for me now, I don't want to go to a funeral of somebody that I know who I haven't dealt with a problem I've had with. And I think that can happen, and it does happen. And then I live with that. I should have called the guy and said, I'm sorry for something stupid I said or whatever.
Rob, what do you hope, if you could perfectly bottle some lesson that each of us could take from your life experience, your pastoral experience, your experience as coroner, your experience having critical open heart surgery, just from your life, if there was something you could bottle and each of us could take that bottle and drink and implement it, like what would you hope that each of us can capture from your story?
Well, I think for me, I think I've been blessed. And it's not because I've, like you say, planned my life out and I can check, I did this, I did that, I did. I've done so many things, and I'm glad I have, but I've never really set out to do any of them, really. I mean, I just got married young and was a carpenter and thought that was a great trade, and I think it is today because I've used that in my whole life. That's been a blessing to me to be able to do things with my hands and stuff. But I never thought of that when I initially started that. And then opportunities come along, and you either say, I've got a pretty good thing going here. I don't want to rock the boat and change course or whatever. So I would say, take advantage of opportunities that come before you and say, well, I've never done that, but I think I can do that. And find out when you do it that there's enjoyment in doing it. I mean, I'm not saying there's a lot of enjoyment in being coroner, but there are some positive things of being coroner that I enjoy. A lot of it is gruesome and ugly and sad and difficult, but obviously I wouldn't keep doing it if there wasn't something there that I would say just take advantage of things that are before you. Like I said before, I have no idea after this chapter of my life is over, what's the next thing? But I'll be doing something, and I don't know what that is right now, but I'm open to that. And I think we need to be more open to change and to diversity and to doing things differently than I've done. I think we can get locked into a boring life where it's secure, but it's really boring. And I can honestly say my life is not boring at all. And it's exciting, it's fun, and I really look forward to what the next thing is that God has for me.
I'm really drawn to the way that you've approached your life and the way you do approach life. You speak about it in a relaxed and easygoing way, and maybe that's how you actually experience the way that you navigate life, in a pretty relaxed and easygoing way. And at least the way you present it, it's such a contrast with the way I can be sometimes, which is just, I'm always asking, is this the best thing to do? Is this it can really white knuckle it. And I think at 46, one of the things that I'm learning to do, I'm teaching myself to do, is to let go of that demand that I know what's next or what the best thing is. And I think those superlative words, best, most, those are really tough words to have in our hearts and minds, because we don't in fact know what the best is or the most is, but we like to sometimes think that we can pursue those. And so I just have been trying to teach myself to do the next thing, to do today, to see the opportunity in front of me, much like you're saying. And I'm really drawn to the way that you have approached your life and led your life. And I really appreciate that example, because it's a very helpful sort of counterbalance or counterweight to some of my natural instincts.
One of the things that I was going to say kind of defines my life is that I'm, kind of open to opportunities around and stuff. Graduated from high school in 1965, and my parents said, you need to go to this Bible college. I really didn't want to go, but I went for a year and a half, and then I quit. Then I got involved at church. They asked me to be youth pastor. I said, I got to go back to school. So I went back to school in 1974 and put my college degree back together again. I left college on the wrong end of the dean's list and graduated 16 years later. I was the longest reinstated student at Trinity at that time. So I started in 65, graduated in 81. And that kind of is a picture of my life. You know, I wanted to go back. I wanted to do it, not because my parents said I should go to college and to go to a Christian college, but I wanted to. And it made a difference in my academics. And so I ended on the right side of the dean's list after 16 years. But it was kind of funny because I remember my graduation as I don't know how old I was at that time, but I was a little bit older than most of the kids that were graduating at that time.
Well, that seems like then it's an important part of the recipe for the kind of life you've led so far, is being willing to go with your energy. Like if something is appealing to you and you want to do something, you move toward that thing. And so it's not as if there's been no sort of underlying foundation for the way you've lived your life. You've just been willing to move where your energy and your want to were going. Is that good? Is that correct?
Yep.
I think there's plenty of us, and I would include myself in this, who can have a hard time acknowledging what we want and pursuing what we want because we do some of that instant critique and judgment of we probably shouldn't that, or it's probably wiser to do this. And some of those inner critiques can be because we think a certain path is more prudent or secure or safe. If there's anything I'm learning through all these conversations, is that life isn't safe or secure or predictable. And your experience as coroner certainly bears that out. I mean, these are families and loved ones sitting around going, but we thought ... Rob, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you for spending the time. I've learned a lot from you, and I've said often to others that if nobody was listening to this podcast, and thankfully a few are, but if nobody was listening, I would still love having these conversations because they always end up making an impact in my life, always benefits and enriches me, and I really appreciate it. So thank you, and thank you for your continued service to our community as coroner, and just your commitment to people's well-being generally in life. Thank you.
Good. This was fun. Thanks for having me.
And for those listening, remember, you really are going to die. You're going to leave this life. It will be over. And it might be in a bunch of years. It could be in the next 5 minutes. And that is not an exaggeration. That really is the truth. So you are going to die, but you are not dead yet. So get after it. Let's take a minute to let the 3 questions that Rob shared ring in our ears and sink into our hearts and minds. How do you answer those questions? For some of you, these questions are familiar because for one reason or another, whether wiring or necessity or some of both, like me, you've wrestled with them consciously. For others of you, maybe these questions feel annoying or really uncomfortable, and you'd rather not give them any more time or energy than you already have just listening to this episode. Or maybe you've genuinely never given them the time of day, not because you're avoiding them, but just because they haven't come up for you. No matter which of those people you are, if Rob is accurate, and these questions and their answers have real-world implications, if they actually have a huge influence on the way we live day in and day out, then it makes a lot of sense to answer them for ourselves. Where did you come from? How do you get the most out of this life while you're here? And what happens when you're gone? My purpose as a coach is to help you deploy your unique purpose in the world. Connect with me on Facebook at Andrew Petty Coach, or email me at andrew@digdeepwinbig.com. I'll help you create the life you know you were made to live. To learn about Graveyard Group Masterminds, where you tap into the power of your mortality, to become the person you are made to be and live the life you are made to live, visit digdeepwinbig.com/The Graveyard Group. So glad you tuned in today. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe. And I'll see you next time on Andrew Petty is Dying.